Good day to everyone. I guess this particular topic, tackling drench resistance, is one that we have tackled as a sheep producing community for a very long time. So it may be said, what new is there to learn? But what I'm hoping today, of course, is that what I say is a reminder and maybe an update, and here and there may be some new things. But sorry, just got to. There we go. So today's agenda, basically two aspects to it. Firstly, the planning of worm control, and got to say that there's probably not a lot new on the horizon, or at least any new strategies, tactics, technologies that we can talk about compared to what has been recommended for a very long time. So I'm going to run through what we have been recommending. Most of this will be on the Worm Boss website, which continues to provide us a basic sort of backstop. So all of these various points I have there, we'll talk in in detail enough, I hope, but bearing in mind that there's certainly a lot of information about this and not a lot has changed there. On the other hand, the second part, planning drench choices, which basically is about drenches and drench resistance. I guess there has been a little bit of movement, probably for the worse, regarding resistance getting worse, not necessarily on your particular farm, because it does vary farm to farm, but in the end, we need to be aware of what's the likely options we have that are going to be effective. Probably the worst thing to do is to be drenching sheep with a product that turns out not to be as effective as you expect. So the result, maybe many months down the track, aren't what you expected. Often you're not aware of that, and all you see is a problem has happened. We need to know where we are with the basic tool we use as drenchers. My statement here, as Fiona mentioned, I'm not affiliated with any commercial group at all. I run my own business, so when I lapse into using a product name, it's generally to make sure we're all on the same page, but I have no particular affiliation with any company. I do declare, though, I'm a director of the company that makes the Barber's pole worm vaccine. Again, not pushing up specifically, but I will mention it when we do come to that. So today I'll mostly be talking about worm control as it applies to sheep producers in New South Wales. After all, this is presented by AWI Extension New South Wales. But comments are going to be pretty general through most areas, and including winter rainfall areas. In general terms, the recommendations that we would make for putting together a sheep worm control program is going to apply pretty much anywhere. So, kicking off to the first section of planning a worm control program, basically the first thing to look at is seasonal weather conditions, and this is as an annual pattern. So every year, of course, the seasons vary. It might be warmer, certainly across most of Australia. We've had a warmer autumn period than normal. That has implications for worm survival. Generally helps them, in fact, but as a general basis, we need to sort of recognise that there's a big difference in terms of the season. Autumn is always a key time for worm control. Now, we're toward the very end of autumn. We're about to enter winter, but I guess most of what I'm going to say is sort of round about this time of year, and I'd be talking in slightly, different topics or different information if we were doing this, say, 6 months later. But basically, the two key things to note, of course, is that in some rainfall areas, the cooler weather slows down Barber's pole worm, that being the key worm of interest there. When we're talking about the non-seasonal uniform rainfall areas, and then the areas where it's winter-dominant rainfall, cooler weather allows the main worm types there, the scour worms, the winter worms, to develop. And of course, Barber's pole does exist and can be a major risk there, slows them down. So tackling them one by one, so turning first to the summer dominant rainfall areas, our friend Barber's pole worm, we can see the picture of it there with the red and white striping, which gives it the term Barber's pole. It's by far and away the main concern, and all through the warmer months, so sometime mid-spring right through till sometime into autumn, Barber's pole worm is a risk. We know it to be a sporadically occurring risk, and sometimes we can predict it. If there's been a bit of recent rain, the risk goes up. Dry periods less so, but for all that, we've all probably seen it come out of nowhere at times and claim sheep. Black scour worm, though, does exist. There's a number of others, but of the non-Barber's pole types, black scour is probably the main one that we'd be concerned about. and that's mostly a winter problem. Not necessarily always. Generally, when we control Barber's Pole, we're also controlling black scour reasonably, but at times it can be out of sync. So I need to be aware of that. I guess the key points for this part of the world, summer dominant areas, is that Barber's pole worm development ceases or slows or even ceases in winter. Certainly the eggs can stop hatching with really cold temperatures. As soon as you're getting below about 10 degrees C, Barber's pole worm eggs won't hatch and through to the larval stage, but the larvae can survive. They're much tougher than the worm eggs. So we need to be aware that the Barber's pole worm larvae may survive through winter, but in decreasing numbers. They don't like the cold either, and after a period of say 3, 4, certainly 5 months, we'd expect that most pastures would be free of Barber's pole larvae if there'd been no more worms placed onto that pasture. So we can use the winter period to reduce Barber's pole numbers, and ideally sheep coming onto a pastures this time of year having low worm counts of any sort of worm, but particularly Barber's pole worm. If we can maintain low numbers of worms going onto the pasture through that winter period, it means that the sheep aren't going to be exposed to more worms coming out of winter into spring. And what we really want is, or want to avoid, is fueling a Barber's pole problem early in the season. So we want Barber's pole numbers in sheep to be as low as they can be in by early spring, ahead of the time when Barber's pole can explode if conditions suit. So moving now to the uniform, the non-seasonal and areas where more winter rainfall. Winter worms are more of an issue, but so we're talking here about, as well as the black scour, the Trichostrongylus, the brown stomach worm, reveling in the name Telodorsagia, and there's a few others. Barber's pole worms exist, can be sporadic. As you get more into the winter dominant areas, Barber's pole can almost drop out as being much of a risk. But for most of the state of New South Wales, Barber's pole is there in the background, sometimes in the foreground. So always need to be aware. More cropping in these parts of the world, so they offer opportunities for low worm pastures, and we'll talk about low worm pastures in a bit of depth. Cooler weather allows the winter worms to develop. I guess in contrast to the scour, to the Barber's pole, winter periods, colder times of the year are actually the time when they thrive. They don't do so well in the hot, dry time of year, but certainly through winter they'll survive for quite some time, often for many months on a pasture over the winter period. And I guess the general strategy here, and this applies very much in the true winter rainfall areas, but right through non-seasonal areas as well. Wherever the winter worms, the scour worms, the brown stomach and black scour worms especially, are a real issue, we want worm egg counts to be low at this time of year. So I use the figure 100 eggs per gram. That's a very low figure, not always easily achievable, and it'll depend year to year on how achievable that is at this time of year. But basically, as we go into the time of year when the scour worms are going to be quite happy on pasture and their larvae will survive for many months, we want worm egg counts to be as low as they can be. I'm turning now to the second element of a recommendation for putting together a control program. Low worm risk pastures, call them worm safe pastures. Worm free is maybe going a bit far. Probably the only true worm free pastures we have is cereal stubbles after harvest, or maybe in some extreme parts of pastoral areas. In fact, certainly once you get into the really low rainfall areas, then worms are really struggling. But I guess what we're talking about here is the strategy where we deliberately prepare paddocks by spelling them from sheep or goats, and make the point that goats carry the same worms pretty much as sheep do, and for that matter as cattle do. So need to put sheep and goats in the same category here. We need to spell a pasture from sheep or goats for long enough for the worm larvae to die off, so that there's the paddock isn't a risk for further worm pickup when sheep graze. And the idea is that sheep with low worm burdens at the start, hopefully as close as we can to zero, when they go onto a prepared low worm risk pasture, will stay worm free. Often it's for many months. And adult sheep in good nutritional condition, in fact, that certainly does happen. It's one of the weapons against worms that we have that often we don't realise, is that sheep in good nick handle worms pretty well. and provided we don't overwhelm them by more moving them to heavily contaminated pastures. And the idea is that as we move sheep into a prepared paddock, ideally you would test to make sure that the egg count is low. We don't want to be bringing worms, big numbers of worms, onto a paddock that we've gone to some trouble to prepare. And if they need a drench, fair enough, drench them as they go into that paddock. But ideally then we're putting them in a situation where they're going to stay worm-free for quite some months. A lot of information about this, so I won't necessarily give more than, I guess, a few points on it, but Worm Boss contains chapter and verse in a big way about this. It's quite a large topic, but also this particular series, webinar series, AWI Extension New South Wales webinar, there's a specific webinar on preparing low worm risk pastures. And more recently, in fact, only back in March this year, a Beyond the Bale article, which Fiona actually comments on that particular webinar, which provides a lot of information about this particular topic. So the key issue always when we're talking about preparing a worm risk or a low worm pasture is how long the paddocks need spelling before enough larvae die off. And I guess that's not easy to answer except in looking at a specific situation. There's a few ground rules we'll go through, but in general it depends on how many larvae you bring into it to begin with, or how many worms in the sheep that you bring into it to begin with. But basically it depends on seasonal conditions. And when we're looking at preparing a paddock, like keeping sheep out of it for some time, the general rules are that hotter temperatures, you get a quicker kill for worms. They don't like temperatures anything much above about 30 degrees, certainly 35 is generally lethal. Cool periods, once you're talking about below 20, certainly mid-teens, much longer survival, better conditions for hatching of the eggs and longer survival for the worm larvae. And as a general rule, the more moisture, the more green pasture we see, the more potential there is for a worm risk. Worms need moisture for the egg to develop to the larval stage, but then mild conditions indicated by green pasture also mean they'll be conducive to worm larval survival. So here we have a couple of very different situations to look at. So the top one is a cereal pasture. It's a crop stubble, and sheep have been probably had a drench as they went into that, and they'll stay worm-free pretty much through the entire summer. In that case, that even if there was rainfall onto that paddock, there's been no worms on that particular pasture for many months. All the time that it was after the crop had been planted, and so there's very little worm risk. But the bottom one's a very different story. Nice green pasture, and those sheep are there like to be at risk. And certainly worm larvae can survive, say from this time of year, so we're talking about late May, right through. Certainly there'll be a small number of larvae on the pasture, of winter worm larvae especially. Barber's pole will tend to drop out because they tolerate cold less well than do the winter worms. But we can expect that some worms that might be there now, say late May, some might still be there in September. Even October, after that warming temperatures, we'll kill them if there's no further ones placed onto the pasture. But very different story, simply looking at the state of the pasture. A few options that come up. Well, I've mentioned the cereal crops, which is probably the best one where that occurs. And of course, for decades, people have been actively using crop stubbles as a safe pasture for worms. So crops off, sheep bunged into the crop stubbles, and you can go on holidays knowing that sheep are going to be pretty ripe for worms, unlikely to pick up further worms there. Unless the rare event, they took a lot of worms with them, and then there was a rain event with a late finish to the season. But those things need to be managed at the time. But cereal crops, where they exist, are a very good option. Where people are running cattle, then a cattle paddock spell for, it may often be a matter of 3, 4, 5 months from sheep, will be a good option because cattle don't carry the same worms. There's one worm, only one important worm, or occasionally important worm that crosses over, one of the black scow species. It's not a major one. So generally spelling a paddock, or at least grazing with cattle and then moving sheep in, is a pretty good safe pasture option. I say not goats, and that's my reminder to remember that goats actually share the worms of both cattle and sheep. So we can't use goats in the role that we would with cattle there. Other crops, though, grown for forage, hay, silage, the same thing. If we've got a period of quite some months where there's been a growing crop, then that means that there's no worms on that pasture, and in that time, any larvae that might have been there before the paddock, before sowing, will have generally long gone. Though we don't always have such options, so one very good one is where we've deliberately treated the sheep to make sure they do have low worm burdens. One of the, common ones is we're using long-acting drenches. I'll speak a bit more later about making sure that they actually do work, because there's not much benefit in deliberately treating sheep with a long-acting, generally an injection, expecting there's going to be a long period of where the sheep are worm-free. If it turns out the resistance to that drench type means that it's not. But with that caveat, then where sheep are given a long-acting treatment for against Barber's pole worm and the brown stomach worm, the long-acting moxidectin injection will give, where there's no resistance, will give about close to 3 months, 13 weeks protection, which is obviously a decent length of time to allow worm larvae to drop, to die off. Barbavax functions in the same way, where people are using the Barber's pole worm vaccine against that worm. Part of the program with Barbavax does involve frequent checks with worm egg counts to make sure that you're on target. So most times it's a good option, because not only was the Barbavax keeping the numbers of worm eggs going onto the pasture low, but as part of the program, you generally have a fairly fair handle on the sort of worm burdens that sheep have got. Also, other situations where sheep, not necessarily given a specific treatment, but confirmed to have very low worm counts. So mature sheep, dry sheep, in good body condition, typically have far, far lower worm egg counts. I mean, everyone who's been doing worm egg counts for some years will know this. Have very low, often low counts, and may well be something going some way towards a low worm risk pasture. I guess the point to make is that the highest risk paddocks on the other side of the coin, always after an outbreak of worm disease has occurred, and that really is a danger situation to leave the sheep in that paddock. They need to be moved out, or else maybe given an effective, if it's an effective long-acting treatment. That's another option, but other than that, the sheep need to be moved out. People often say, I haven't got a worm-free paddock, where can I move them? The fact is, out of that paddock, because staying in the paddock where there's been an outbreak of a worm disease, almost certainly the sheep are going to be exposed to more worms, and the problem is likely to continue. So is it practical? Well, there's various options to look at there, but bearing in mind that there's only so many paddocks that you can actually actively plan ahead to be low worm pastures, we need to prioritise the sheep that are the most at risk and at the most beneficial time. And so I'd nominate these as pregnant lactating ewes, both for themselves. We don't want stress on the ewes while they're lactating, and hoping to rear a decent lamb, but also because the lambs, as they graze the paddock, the lambing paddock, are picking up whatever worms are there. So they're the second lot we need to look after. So that picture's got both of them there, the ewes there with lambs at foot. So in their first year, sheep, generally until about sometime 12 months, and in some cases, some individuals until longer than that, they are at their most susceptible to worms. Their immunity is still developing, and certainly from the time they're around about 3 to 4 months of age, they're especially susceptible to worms. So we need to think of that in terms of how we treat them. It may be that they were born on a paddock which had very few worms anyway, and worm egg counts will confirm that they're in good shape. They can remain on that paddock. Otherwise, they may need to be moved, either at weaning, if they're around to be weaned around the 3 to 4 month mark. If they're staying on the mums, like maybe if they're going to stay on the ewes until they go off to a meatworks, maybe the entire flock needs to move. But worm egg counts will indicate where you are on the risk situation. The lowest priority on the farm, the sheep that we need to think least about, as I've said earlier, is those dry sheep in good body condition, and bearing in mind that Barber's pole worm can be a risk to any sheep class. So people in the major Barber's pole areas will have seen even dry wethers in good nick at times suffer from Barber's pole. So with that, bearing that in mind, dry sheep are the ones that we can probably consider will tolerate worms better, with the caveat also that we need to keep an eye on with worm egg counts. And that brings us neatly to monitoring the worm risk. Now, following worm egg counts to checking that sheep are tolerating worms or not at risk of worm disease has been around for a long time. There's numerous benefits. Obviously, it confirms whether disease signs are due to worms. An outbreak of Barber's pole is often fairly self-evident from the signs, but sheep, say, that are scouring, there's several causes of scouring, whether it's scour worms or some other disease. A worm egg count will fairly quickly sort that out. But often when sheep are in a situation where there's not actually any signs of worms, and you wouldn't necessarily think there's a problem, the sheep look more or less okay, we need to know that we haven't got low-level worm burdens which are reducing production. So and it may be that a worm egg count of, say, 200 to 300 eggs per gram of scour worms wouldn't necessarily be producing any scouring or any visible signs, but it may be producing or reducing wool growth and body weight gain by maybe as much as 10%. And also, we use worm egg counts to check that paddocks are as safe as worm-safe pasture. If sheep grazing a paddock that we believe to be or expected to be, we set up to be relatively low worm risk, we can check that with worm egg counts to check that is the case. So very, very quickly, monitoring, it's an easy thing to do. Hunting a sheep into a mob there, you can mob them up into a corner or just anywhere in the paddock for that matter, leaving them stand for a few minutes, leaning back on the ute while let them do their thing and drop a few pebbles, moving on to the area and picking up the pebbles. And there's my picture of a container, and you might notice there's a bit of steam inside, a bit of condensation. That tells us that those pellets have been passed in the last few minutes, that they're pretty fresh. They're the only ones we want, because dry pellets picked up the ground may well have been a situation where the worm eggs have hatched. They won't be picked up in the count, so we get a false result. So we do want the totally fresh ones, and the only way to know is if there's a bit of condensation. Even on a 40°C day, you can pick worm the dung pellets up, and they will steam inside the container. So a good way of checking that we've got a nice fresh sample. Then off we go, whether you're doing the counting yourself or sending it off to a laboratory to be done. We look at the worm eggs under the microscope and give a count, and then the count. Generally, we look at the average of the mob to give us a mob average. Now and again, the information from individual counts will also alert us to particular developing problems. The interval that we need to monitor varies very much with their worm risk, so susceptibility to worms, and I guess it comes back to these two classes of sheep. The lambs in the first year of life yet to develop a strong immunity, so they're the ones we need to keep especially an eye on. Lactating ewes, whether it's setting them up before the lambs drop or during lactation, and especially if there's a risk, and especially if it's a risk of Barber's pole worm, we need to be on the button with knowing worm situation in lactating ewes, because they temporarily lose their immunity over for the period, for the couple of months after the lamb drops, and they're at a greater risk than other times when they're essentially dry. So we need to bear in mind that when we're monitoring worm egg counts, there's particular classes of sheep that are more at risk than others. We also need to bear in mind when we're monitoring the interval depend on the seasonal worm risk. So if we're talking in, say, the non-seasonal and especially winter rainfall areas, then through hot, dry summer periods, there's going to be far less of a risk. But also within seasons, so severity of risk, Barber's pole worm versus winter worms. In summertime, Barber's pole, of course, is in Barber's pole areas where it's a common threat. It's always going to be around. If we get a few days of rain, and certainly enough to freshen up the pasture, then the Barber's pole worm risk increases. And so a matter of perhaps, say, 4 to 5 weeks after, we need to allow time for Barber's pole worm eggs to develop, or all worm eggs to develop, into the stage, the adult worm, which can lay an egg, takes at least 3 weeks. So generally after an event that might trigger the development of worm worm hatching. Need to allow maybe a month, but probably not a lot long, not longer, certainly in Barber's Pole areas, and check whether in fact there has been a heightened risk or whether it was just a flash in the pan. And obviously, if there's signs of worms, then the more worm signs we've seen, the more we need to be thinking about monitoring. In general, intervals vary. I'd say a high risk area where there's a likelihood the season or the type of sheep indicate there's like to be a risk. Around about 4 weekly, low risk 6 weekly plus, and certainly whenever we see any signs of worms in the sheep. Now, these might be considered fairly ideal. A lot of people might say, well, I never monitor anything like that frequency, but might not be for all of the year. It may well be that, that say for Barber's Pole, through the, let's say the 4, 5, 6 months a year when Barber's Pole is a big risk, you might monitor at the high frequency, less so through the cooler period, and vice versa for scour worms through the winter time. Non-drench worm control for a long time, of course, a lot of information about getting away from drenches. For long, we've been talking about breeding worm-resistant sheep, selecting rams that have resistance to worms. It's been around for probably a good 4 decades or so now, and there's very good programs where you can actually identify rams that have been selected specifically for both worm resistance and also for productivity characteristics. Nutrition, that's a lifetime U graph there. The profiles that they use for body condition through the year for ewes is actually a very good parallel with the sort of condition they need to be in to minimise the worm risk. In general terms, once sheep are below a condition score of 2, they're at a greater worm risk. Once they're above 3, then lesser worm risk in general terms. And of course, I mentioned Barbavax earlier, for Barber's Pole specifically, and only for Barber's Pole, this particular vaccine, it requires several hits a year, typically a couple of 3 priming hits, and then probably a couple of others through a season. And so matching, so sometime through from springtime right through till into autumn, and the vaccination, along with measures to reduce the numbers of worms in the pasture to begin with. Barbavax has given some very good results in terms of protecting flocks against what is obviously otherwise an ever-present risk. So I'm going to leave that section and now get on to the section I've called Planning Drench Choices, which is chiefly about drench resistance, and we'll go through talking about resistance and then testing for them and what we can do to reduce the further development of resistance. I guess we've been saying, the advisory community for worm control, been saying for a very long time that drench resistance is a big and an increasing cost. And here's the reasons, which people are generally aware of. Quite plainly, a drench that's not fully effective, not giving you close to 100% removal of worms, isn't going to fully control your worm disease outbreak and may leave some sheep that are still at risk, even though you thought that giving them a drench was going to nip the problem in the bud. Probably more typically is that even though a drench appeared to do a fair job, and if the sheep were looking a little bit off, they've more or less come back after a couple of weeks, there may well be, though, an invisible production loss from moderate worm burdens where instead of getting, let's say 98 to 100% of kill of worms, we only got, let's say, 85 to 95% of a kill, leaving some worms behind, and in some sheep there'll be enough there to continue production loss. A very big effect on the failure of planned worm control programs. So this could well be moving sheep into a low worm pasture. You've gone to all the trouble of preparing a low worm pasture and then giving a drench that doesn't kill all the worms, moving them onto that paddock, and instead of staying worm free, they recontaminate the pasture with the worm eggs they have brought in, or the worms they brought in, and the problem could continue, and you don't get the desired benefit from the effort you've gone to. Also, with strategic worm control programs where you've gone to some trouble again to drench sheep going for, say, against Barber's Pole going into winter, or for scour worms going into summer, putting them onto a crop stubble, leaving worms there. Some of the worms will survive through summer and they'll still be there in autumn. So very important that we get the best out of the effort we go to with planning control programs, that we use an effective drench. And I guess a bit of a kicker in the tail is that once resistance develops, if we continue using that particular drench, it'll get worse more rapidly. A few other points. The resistance levels vary very much between different drenches and worm types. We'll look at that as we're coming up into a bit of a survey of the drench types in a minute. Resistance pattern varies in individual properties, so we need to test individually rather than assume information from, say, around the district might apply. Bearing in mind that worms generally occur as mixed species burden, so even if we thought that, let's say, Barbus pol is chiefly the chief problem, and very likely that is the case, very frequently it might be 95% of the worm burden there, there's likely to be other worms present at the same time, and unless we take some account of those, it may well be that we're leaving some worms there, even though we think we've treated the main problem. I guess the key issue or key point to make is that resistance is generally not visually obvious until it's severe. So the fact that a drench isn't killing Barbus pol won't become evident until maybe some sheep die after you've given a drench to stop a problem when it occurred, and yet sheep continue dying afterwards, and the same with scour worms. And often people aren't aware that a particular drench isn't effective when there's no sign of the fact that there's no change in the sheep. They look okay, and you're not aware that the drench in fact is dropping down in its effectiveness. Now, before we talk about resistance levels in different sorts of drenches, I guess I've got to make the point that the resistance patterns around Australia, we have fairly limited information on this. There's relatively few tests done compared with, say, 20 and 30 years ago, when for some time there was a lot of worm drench resistance testing. The companies, animal health companies, do a lot of testing, or a certain amount of testing, and now and again they provide information. Some of it's public, and I take account of that where I can. I guess there's also discussion amongst our colleagues, and gives me some clues. And people like some of the rural merchandisers conduct tests, and I guess I've put all that I can together from the information that I'm privy to, and I'm not giving specific percentages of particular drenches, because this isn't survey information. I guess I'm putting together the information that I've come across by discussed with colleagues, and what I've been able to piece together where I've investigated. But I think basically, again, talking to colleagues, I'll be pretty sure that what I'm saying is what most people would expect, and it fits with the general pattern over the years from what's been reported and confirmed, that where we're moving as drench resistance moves on. Just a quick reminder of the various groups that we have to deal with, because I'm then going to go through and talk about where we are for the different groups regarding resistance levels as we believe. So for a long time, of course, these have been the three broad spectrum groups: the white drenches, benzoazoles, the clear drenches, levamasol types, and the MLs, macrocyclic lactones, which include ivermectin, abamectin, and oxydectin. They've been around, of course, for quite some time. Had a couple of narrow spectrum drenches which are aimed chiefly at Barbus pol worm, and for the worms we're generally dealing with, we can say pretty much only Barbus pol. Is it closantel, which has some long-acting activity for 4 or 6 weeks time after giving a drench. It'll protect against Barbus pol. Naphthalifos, so this is the old organophosphate drench, known, a lot of people have known it as Ramitin in the past. Polvolt's another name at the moment. There's probably a couple of others, but it's sometimes been called a mid-spectrum drench because it does have some effect against worms other than Barbus pol, but it's chiefly aimed at Barbus pol. But I guess where the action chiefly is these days is the combination drenches. White and clear drenches have been around for a long time. There's widespread resistance these days, unsurprisingly. But people for a long time also have added naphthalifos. In days gone by, it was Ramitin plus a white plus a clear. And together that gave often a pretty useful result. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I guess more recently, the triple combination of a white drench, clear drench, and an ML drench has been around. Whether the ML is abamectin or moxidectin, there's brands on the market for those. And then probably some dozen or more years ago, Zolvix came along as monopantal. Now Zolvix plus with abamectin, and then a couple of years after that, Startict, which is another totally new antiemetic type, Derquantel, came onto the scene. So basically, these are separate. So the monopanel and ivermectin, Derquantel and ivermectin, are quite separate antiemetic groups and separate from all others. So they certainly came to our aid at a time they needed, and we'll look at how things have gone. I guess making the point that I'm going to consider winterworm separately from Barber's poleworm because there's a big difference in the resistance patterns between the two. So let's kick off. We'll first talk about the winterworm, scourworm. So brown stomach worm, black scourworm, and quite a few others. I've got this little caveat, best bet information, and that's the what the best we can work with at the moment, but it'll probably be reasonably close, I'd expect. So looking at our groups that we've talked about before, I haven't talked about the narrow spectrums here because they're not useful for this class of worm, for the winter worms. But for a long time, resistance has been common to all of our broad spectrums alone, and we simply wouldn't be recommending that anyone by themselves would be expecting you to get good activity using any of those. Not to say here and there on the odd property that may well occur. You would need to establish that with a good resistance test and then monitor it, because that would be unusual. And we'd expect also that the combinations, if there's resistance to the white and clear drenches, it means that the combination's not going to work so well. When we turn, though, to the so-called triple combinations, I've got plus clisantral because there are some drenches that actually include clisantral. It's useful, of course, again, for Barber's pole, not for the scourworms, but so here we're talking about a white drench, clear drench, and an ML. And the fact is that resistance has now become common. Now, if I was giving this talk, let's say 5 years ago, I'd be saying that resistance is known, but not especially common. The fact is now that resistance does seem to be fairly common from the feedback I have from talking to our colleagues and what I know of farms where tests are being conducted. Resistance to the triple combination is no longer uncommon. We must expect it does occur, and that's whether the combination is with ivermectin or with moxidectin. However, it's not usually severe. We generally don't see the point where it's below, let's say, 80, 90%. Now, that's obviously not good, but if we use the cutoff point of 95% is what we're expecting for a drench, where we declare that it's effective and resistance occurs once a drench is below that figure, then most times the triple combinations are nowhere near as bad as we would expect from the individual components, the white, clear, or ML types. When we look at the newer drench types, resistance has been detected, and in fact there's reports in the scientific press about resistance to Startict. Somehow I've got these around the wrong way, so my apologies to the manufacturers here. So please take on board the fact that I should have Startict as Derquantel and ivermectin and Zolvix Plus as monopantal. But with that small, if significant, point made, resistance has been detected. There's no question resistance has been detected, but it's not common or severe to either. Most times we can expect those products are going to work. Not to say we shouldn't test them, but we can generally expect that against the scourworms, those products are going to work. So, moving on to resistance to Barber's poleworm, it's a different story. And as you can see, the single biggest one there, when we look at the broad spectrum, is that levamisole. I haven't put a line through in terms of widespread and common resistance, because a large percent of the properties, it seems, so again, from the feedback that the advisory community is getting, is that levamisole is still doing a fair job. Even if there's some resistance, it's really going to be really severe. For some reason, it's a genetic capacity for the particular worm's interaction with the levamisole chemical, is that the resistance has gone nowhere near the level that it has for the other types. It's common in Barber's poleworm to the white drenches. It's very common in the ML types, but far less so to levamisole. Does occur, certainly resistance does occur in Barber's pole to levamisole, but it's far less common. And similarly with naphthalofos. The old organophosphate, resistance it hasn't stood up as well as levamisole has. There's certainly more cases of resistance to naphthalofos, it seems, again from what I can glean, than to levamisole, but it still appears likely has a role. So when we come to looking at the combinations, anything with levamisole in it is going to have some activity we'd expect against Barber's pole. So it includes the white and clear combination, the combination especially with naphthalofos, given that there's less resistance, it seems, in Barber's pole to levamisole and naphthalofos. That's going to have a useful role. The triple combinations also. And now again, I see on this particular slide, I've got the star tectins of X plus in the wrong place, so apologies to the companies. Again, as for the scourworms, resistance has been detected in Barber's pole to the new Drench types, but it's not common and it's not severe. So I guess we'll be aware that they're in the armoury in a big way, though we still need to test them. One thing I should mention before this webinar is available for downloading, I'll make sure that the product names are in their correct order. So bottom line, moving on, is that there's no role, and this has been the case for a very long time, probably 15 years, 10, 20 years, there's no role for the individual types, BZ, ivermectin, nabmec, or clisantral. Now, specifically clisantral in summer rainfall areas, clisantral still appears to be useful in winter rainfall areas, basically where Barber's pole is only an occasional visitor, and far less of it has been used. Clisantral may well be useful. So winter rainfall areas, you may well still get good activity from clisantral against Barber's pole when it occurs. But need to be aware that in the Barber's pole areas, clisantral resistance is very common. And with this also, levamisole mostly affected Barber's pole. Can't rely on it at all for the scourworms, widespread resistance, but mostly effective for Barber's pole. Resistance does occur to it, and property by property, we need to establish that indeed it does before we could rely on it. Moxidectin, so moxidectin is the introduced initially as cydectin, and there's numerous brands now, of course, but it's now common to most of the major worms, especially to brown stomach worm and to the Barber's pole worm. Now, one problem or one point that arises with this is that moxidectin as an injection is commonly used in the long-acting, in moxidectin LA forms, where we're expecting up to 3 months protection against those two major worms. We can no longer expect that. One of the first things that happens with resistance to a particular Drench type is that any persistent period, any long-term, long-acting effect reduces before you actually see it no longer effective against killing the whatever worms happen to be at the time. And that's obviously has implications for how much we can rely on the long-acting moxidectins. Resistance to the triples, as I've mentioned, so the white, clear, and ML types is now common to scourworms, less so to Barber's pole because of the levamisole component. But we need to bear in mind we can't no longer say, oh, well, I take on board the fact that the single active type drenches, I can't rely on anymore, but bunging them all together with 3 types, surely that'll do the trick. Won't necessarily do the trick. We need to test that and establish that that is the case. Resistance is rare, still seems to be rare from what we can understand, and it's rarely severe and to the newer drenches, the new drench types. Again, can't 100% be sure of that. We simply, when we're looking at what's most likely to work, we can, I guess, simply make that point. Combinations are most effective, and normally we would recommend a combination of some sort is used as a routine. So I'm moving on now to, as we get toward the end, testing for drench resistance. The whole point is that because the pattern is very farm to farm, we do need to check on a particular farm. The 2 types of tests that Worm Boss recommends is drench test or drench check. Both look at the change in worm counts. Drench test, we look at several drench groups in one go. So we test and say, what have we got? Here's my several options. What have we got that might work? Drench check is a spot drench. And Worm Boss gives chapter and verse on the particular types of drench that we checking test or drench resistance test that we could use. I won't spend any time on going through the particular types, but point made that drench test is where you have several groups of sheep and test with different types of drenches. So whichever ones that are likely to work, and depending where you are, there might be some that you don't bother testing with any longer, and some that you do. Any test of like this nature is best done on lambs or weaners. They like to have the biggest worm counts, and importantly, doing a worm species identification test is important so that we can say resistance is at a certain level against the scour worms. We generally for this test would lump together black scour, brown stomach and others versus the barber's pole worm, because as we've seen, there's quite different patterns. The drench check is a spot test where sheep are in the yards. They're going to be drenched anyway, as this chap is doing. So why not do a wormy count when the sheep are in the yards and send it off and see what we get, and then nip out into the paddock 14 days later. That's the specific time we'd recommend, a fortnight. So if you've done the drench on a Monday, 2 weeks time, you're out in the paddock picking up some samples, sending them off. And if your initial count was, say, 400 eggs per gram, and it's gone down to the point where it's, let's say, 20 eggs per gram, well, you know that you've had a pretty fair but not total result. If it's close to zero, then you can say, right, that drench is well and truly in the frame. So it gives you a pretty fair idea. And over the course of a year, you could check several different drench types and get a clue. As with the drench test, using younger sheep is better, and getting a worm species identification also adds to the information. Reducing the development of resistance. Now, this is a big topic by itself, but probably the biggest thing is that drench frequency is probably the single biggest factor in terms of the more exposure, as we'd expect. The more exposure of worms to drenches, the more likelihood there'll be that they develop resistance, the more opportunities for that. We want to rationalise. I don't necessarily say minimise or reduce, but we want to rationalise the number per sheep, and it may well vary between class of sheep and even the different mobs, different flocks of sheep for a particular class on the farm. But we start basically with an effective planned program, and all of those points we've gone through: seasonal treatments, low worm pastures, worm monitoring, non-chemical and so forth. All of those tactics feed into an effective planned program. And if we have an effective planned program, there should not be a need for excessive or any drenching more than we'd otherwise need to. This is a big topic, drench resistance management tactics using what's so-called refugia strategies, basically ensuring that there's some non-resistant worms left on the farm that will dilute out resistant ones. It's a large topic. There's a lot of, I guess, issues there. I guess point one with reducing development resistance, I think, is to get the frequency down to the minimum that you need to, that's compatible with good worm control. On top of that, bringing in specific strategies to make sure that those resistant worms are the fewest. That's an addition. Worth chasing that information up. But then the whole issue of drench selection is vital here. If we continue using drenches to which resistance has developed, we're only going to make it worse and won't get the result that we expected. And it means that our strategies that we put some effort into, especially low worm pastures, are not going to be as effective. So firstly, we need to be realistic about what's likely to work. So going back to the quick gallop we did through the different drench types for different sorts of worms, what worms are most likely to be a possibility. In general, we would recommend combinations. The logic simply is that the more drenches you put together, the more likely is that some worms at least won't be resistant to one component, if not all. Testing drenches is the only way to be sure, and it varies between properties individually. And we need to manage long-acting treatments. They have the potential to exacerbate resistance, because for a long time the only drench that the worm's exposed to is that particular one that you've given. It's not a reason to not consider long-acting drenches. They do have a role, of course, but we need to restrict them where there's going to be a clear need and benefit. It may be, say, ahead of lambing for ewes and for sheep that are going into a particularly high-risk situation where we know we can't do much else about it. But we do need to be aware that resistance is common to moxidectin, which is the ingredient in the Moxie LA types, and to closantal, which is obviously the specific for barber's pole. Primer and exit treatments are necessary. In many cases, unless you were 100% sure, hand on heart, with a recent resistance test that moxidectin was 100% effective, you could not risk not giving a primer drench. So at the time you give the injection, you also give other drenches to wipe out worms which might have been left by the moxidectin component. And then at the end of it, we may well be left with some worms in the sheep. We need to clear those out as well. Along the way, with long-acting treatments, we need to do worming counts to check that indeed they are working. Where they're working, work well, have the potential to be harmful unless they're managed properly. So I'm going to wind it up with a very quick summary. The two aspects we talked about were planning worm control. So all of these various points, a bit of emphasis on the low worm pastures and the monitoring worm egg counts and so forth. Planning drench choices, and again, we've gone through those particular parts. I'd specifically, I guess, note that the drench check, I do think, is an underutilised tactic. When sheep are in the yards for drenching, simply taking an egg count then and then following that up 2 weeks later is a very good way to check whether a particular drench may or may not be useful. I guess for more information, you can't go past the local people. The local vets and advisors in New South Wales, the local land services vets have terrific information on their local situation. They're an excellent source of advice. But in general terms, because worm patterns, resistance patterns, and the seasonal risk and the between-year risk varies, getting some local advice has got to be the paramount recommendation. The Parabos suite of websites, of course, remains our backstop, and for worms, we're talking specifically about Worm Boss. And if all else fails, I'm always happy to be consulted and give whatever talk I can, bearing in mind, though, that we're best where we can using a local advisor rather than someone like me who might be thousands of kilometres away. There's a lot of general points, and I'm happy to help where I can. So I say thank you, Fiona, and I'm happy to leave it at that.
Thanks, Brown.
So
fantastic presentation. We certainly jam-packed a lot into that. So thank you everyone for hanging around. We have quite a few questions that have already come up. There is a little bit of a theme for the first one, so we might touch on it straight away because you've just dealt with it briefly, and that was refugium. So I have one question. If you need to drench before moving to a low risk paddock, are you selecting for drench resistance, as any surviving worms will be resistant and therefore create a resistant worm population in the paddock? Or are you better to drench and then put them into a previously grazed paddock for a few days and then move them to a low risk worm paddock? Thanks, Brown.
Okay, sure. This often comes up, and I guess I sort of see this as it's almost as long as a piece of string. The obvious problem is that if it's quite true that if you drench sheep and put them into a paddock that is truly a low worm risk paddock, and there's some resistant worms there, you bring them into that, you bring resistant worms, not only worms, resistant worms, which makes the problem worse, into that particular paddock, and you may you impair the effectiveness of that strategy. But if you, on the other hand, said, right, I don't want to risk that, I'm going to pop them into a paddock where they're going to pick up some other worms, I guess you're not sure how many worms they're going to pick up. If they're grazing there for a few days, chances are it's very few. My general thought is that I wouldn't necessarily bother with that strategy. I'd be first step is I'd be hoping I'd be using a drench that was pretty effective. It's going to remove very close to 100% of worms, very few. The few worms left there are generally are rarely going to be of a number that are going to take off in a big way. If you used a drench that was only, say, 90%, 85% effective, that would be a very real risk. And I guess most times you won't know this, but it would be a real risk. Most times, though, certainly low worm pastures prepared through the winter periods are never 100% worm free. That's the only time that occurs really probably is in cereal crop stubbles. But even if we've gone to some trouble and kept cattle on a paddock for 4 months before we move the sheep in, chances are there'll still be a very small number of sheep worms there, and they would act as some refuge or some less resistant worm population there. It's a difficult one. I guess I've got to say that's certainly one that one-on-one with an advisor in a particular region and a particular time of year would be a good one to talk through.
Thanks, Brown. I'm just going to jump around the questions a little bit so I haven't forgotten anyone's questions, but I'm going to stick to the topic of refugia for a minute. I have neighbours who drench their refugia animals with a different active ingredient. For example, a triple active for 90% of the mob and then closantel for 10% of the mob in a winter rainfall zone. Is there anything that will backfire doing this?
I see. So part of the mob, so 90% of the particular mob gets one drench, and the 10%. I mean, again, if you knew at the beginning the worm number, let's say you had a worm egg count, and it was fairly moderate, then that's probably a reasonable strategy. You could say, let's say you had a worm egg count of 500 eggs per gram, and 90% of the mob are going to get some drench that drops them down to close to zero. Then it means that there's only 10% are bringing in potentially 500 eggs per gram. You could do the maths and get some sort of a rough idea of how many worms you're bringing in. I guess my answer to that would be I would not do that unless the initial count was fairly moderate or low. And if I had to put a figure on it, I don't think I'd be doing it unless the count was sort of, say, somewhat lower than 200, 250 eggs per gram, a fairly low count. Otherwise, I do think you risk destroying your the benefit of a low risk pasture.
Thanks, Brown. Question about lactating ewes. Do you need to drench if you drench your lactating ewes, do you need to drench the lambs at the same time, Brown?
General terms, lambs rarely have big burdens of worms until they're around about 8, 10, 12 weeks of age. There's virtually no point at all in drenching lambs that are less than around about 6 weeks of age at all. Virtually never do we find much in the way of worms. They simply haven't had time to pick very many worms up. After all, they've been on milk for quite some time. And then the amount of pasture they take in, you see very young lambs picking up a few strands of green feed, of course, from pretty much from day one. But they're not picking up very many worms. So in general terms, lambs less than 2 months of age rarely have much in the way of worms anyway, and there would be very, very little point. But I certainly have seen cases where lactating ewes, it generally goes back to the fact that worms weren't managed well prior to the lambs dropping. But yep, there you are. At let's say 8 and 9 weeks into lambing, there's decent worm counts in the ewes needing a drench. I guess if the lambs are say older than about 2 months of age, I'd give them the drench. Less than that, I wouldn't. This is pretty rubbery, I guess, and it would depend very much in terms of what the actual counts were. But if you seriously had a problem where the ewes needed, you're obviously going to avoid bringing the ewes into yards, while they're lactating. So there's got to be something pretty bad going on before you'd be doing that. And I guess if the lambs are older than about 2 months, it couldn't hurt to give them a drench.
Thanks, Brown. Brown, here's a great question. It comes up all the time. So can I get you to justify your answer too for this, Brown? Because it's you always get a slightly different tweak on it. How long after drenching to move to a new paddock to make sure all the eggs inside the animal are cleaned out?
Look, yes, this does come up all the time. Sure. I mean, yes, it's true that after you drench, there's still going to be inside the sheep, the worm eggs that are still in the dung that is yet to be excreted, which generally takes around about 48 hours in general terms, to get the dung from the first from the fourth stomach, abomasum, and the small intestine all the way through. So yes, there's potentially worm eggs there. I mean, as a proportion, in general term, I don't consider this to be an enormous risk, and I guess I don't think it justifies keeping sheep off pasture for, say, the 2 days it might take for all of that to pass. I think unless even where, well, especially let's say you're moving to one example would be if you're moving them, say, the end of the year, moving onto a crop stubble, as soon as the eggs hit the deck there, most of them are going to die anyway. It's I guess there's only a potential risk if the paddock they're moving into was a green paddock where worms could potentially survive. Maybe there's a bit of a minor risk. I think in general terms, the effort that you need to go to is not justified. I mean, there may well be situations where the sheep had massive burdens of worms, and let's say it'd been an outbreak of Barber's pole, and the sheep are in really a bad way. Maybe it's worth keeping them off till the next day, drench them today, and then moving the paddock tomorrow. I don't generally consider that though to be to make so much difference in terms of the number of worm eggs that you would bring in compared to the likelihood that you're going to develop a big worm population, I think is so low that I don't consider that an important tactic to be worth it.
Thanks, Brown. Is Barbavax an option for producers in non-seasonal New South Wales?
It is, and it is used by many producers in non-seasonal parts of New South. Basically, what it goes back to is your perception or the reality of the Barber's pole risk. So if the pattern on your property and in the district, and often you can predict this, you can note this over between years. But if it looks like there's every year you've got to consider that there is a genuine Barber's pole worm risk, then Barbavax can be useful. I guess as you go further south into areas where the risk is lower, it's more likely that Closantel will be effective. You need to absolutely establish that before you could rely on Closantel at all. But Closantel has a fairly similar effect in terms of giving you some protection before you need another hit with the vaccine. Bearing in mind with Barbavax, once you embark on the program, you're committing yourself to needing to re-inject the sheep roughly every 6 weeks. So, there's a fair commitment there. So you need to justify it and the cost for that matter too, but especially the effort that's going into it versus the risk. But so I always go back to the fact that if you're seeing Barber's pole as a problem, in other words, if you don't take some specific action, you're going to get an outbreak of Barber's pole in most years. And in a situation where Closantel is not effective, then Barber's pole has to be on the table. I'd very much drive it by what the risk is. We sell virtually no Barber's pole into winter rainfall areas because it's just almost never a big enough risk, and almost always Closantel will do the trick as an alternative. But if it's a risk and it can come out of the blue and around the district that can happen, then absolutely Barber's pole can be an option, and there certainly are producers in non-seasonal areas of New South who do use it.
Thanks, Brown. Can you drench with 2 or 3-way combination drench and then drench with naphthalithos up and down the race twice?
Don't know that I'd use naphthalithos twice. So I don't know would that strategy be to go down one way with a combination, then back on naphthalithos? You could certainly do that. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's the way I read it.
So I suppose the main problem there is that you're putting together 2 fairly high risk actives there. So lefamisole has a lower safety margin than do the white and the clear drenches. The white drench and the ML drenches, and naphthalithos also is notorious for having a low safety margin. But having said that, for many years, people have in fact used levamisole, levamisole as a clear drench and a white drench and naphthalithos before. That was commonly used before the ML drenches came out, actually. And the whole thing is that whenever using naphthalithos, it's the particular active here we need to be thinking of. There is a greater risk, especially you need to be sure that the drench is totally going into the mouth and not down into the lungs. There's a few other issues about not drenching on really hot days, not drenching sheep that have been recently yarded and are still puffing and blowing and so forth with naphthalithos. It has a lower safety risk, and that needs to be borne in mind. But it can, in fact, it can be used with other drenches too.
Thanks, Brown. A couple of scenarios. In the last worm egg count, this person had 70 eggs per gram of esophagostum worm. Is a different management required for this type of worm?
Answer is no. Often we can't really explain the mixture of worms that we get. But every now and again, I guess to my surprise over the years, I've sort of seen when a larval differentiation result has come back, you think, wow, here we are, only let's say 20–30% of black scour brown stomach, and the rest is something like esophagostomum, and can be other types. In general terms, though, the biology is much the same for those worms, and provided my general thought would be, if you're controlling black scour worm, you should be able to control, the similar strategies would control esophagostomum. There's a couple of different species of esophagostomum too, and without going to issues, if you're having feedback from the abattoir regarding nodules, which is one of the species in the large intestine, that the small intestine, that one of the species can do, then you might want to do something about it. It's probably more a timing and drench effectiveness issue, though. Don't generally see a lot of resistance to esophagostomum or Cooperia or Schubertia. These are other different worm types. So in general terms, a program that's effective against black scour, I think would be effective against esophagostomum.
Thanks, Brown. Another scenario, located in the pastoral region. I had a fecal egg count done on 10 samples, Brown. They had a mild to moderate worm burden. So the range was 0 to 320, with 10% of the mob at that higher 320, 40% at 0, and 50% at less than 100 eggs per gram. Would you still decide to drench this flock, or wait till the high-risk periods of lactation and weaning, 4 to 6 weeks post-rainfall period, etc.? Or would you drench now anyway, in the aim of getting every single animal tested below 100 eggs per gram?
Fair question. That's a very low, and a very typical sort of figure. To have 10% in the highest range, and that's not high. 320, is not high, and to have was it 40% or so at 0? I mean, that's exactly how we see it. It's a real ski jump of a picture when you see it, that with the great bulk of sheep in any one flock, and this applies to pretty much any worm egg count done at any time, with the exception of some Barber's pole cases. Generally, though, you have almost all the animals down to lowish sort of count, and only a few at the point where you might think that there's an issue. But in this case, I don't think that flock would. I could see it be. I don't think that would justify drenching at this time. The average, I think, on that must have been, I don't know if the average is given, but probably less than 100. Yeah, so I'd consider that probably a good result. In fact, it's probably fairly typical for this time of year. So without knowing obviously the location and anything about the rainfall and so forth, bearing in mind that in general that it's been a warmer autumn period for pretty much all of, as I can understand, for pretty much all of the farming areas of Australia at the moment. It's probably fairly reasonable. To my mind, I'd simply say it tells us that worms are there. They're well and truly under control at the time. Just I'd go ahead with a worm egg count monitoring time. And the point was made regarding prior to lambs dropping. Yep, I'd certainly take account a good 4 or 5 weeks prior then, and see if you need to revise the idea of a drench.
Thanks, Brown. What is your rule of thumb annual drenching program for winter rainfall areas and the drench types that you will use? And I will add that there you can actually type this into Parabos and get a response. So have a look on the Parabos website. That's from Arthur there, but I'll hand over to you, Brown.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, I mean, yeah, it's true that there's specific programs recommended for, generally it's state by state within WormBoss. But I guess in general terms, if you're talking winter rainfall, the main worms you worry about are the so-called winter worms. So the black scour, the brown stomach, the nematodoruses, and the others we mentioned. The esophagostums, these the tail end of worms, and so. And they survive well through winter, not so through summer. So our going into summer is when we need treatments. The main worms that are going to be of most most of an issue, of course, for them is the main sheep classes again be the lambs going into summer. Depending on when the lambs are dropped, the ewes may well have already gone back to quite low worm egg counts. So if they're lambing in winter, then often by the time you get into to, let's say crops are off December, then their counts are sort of back where their mob averages are sort of well less than 200 eggs per gram and maybe less. But certainly lambs going into summer need looking after, and almost always you'd be looking at a drench either onto a crop stubble or onto a dry pasture ahead of summer. Whether or not you need to for other classes, I'd judge that on the worm egg count. The other side to the to winter rainfall areas though is to keep counts low this time of year. So autumn, as we go into winter, we want counts to be low, and also especially ahead of lambing.
Brown, how often, and we'll just do this time of the year, how often would you suggest we do worm egg counts, and how many samples are needed egg cartonfuls?
Well, as I was indicating, that the interval, the time between, I think varies a fair bit. And again, I'd concentrate my sampling on the ones that are most likely to have problems, which is always going to be lambs in their first year of life. Always in areas where Barber's poll is likely to be a risk through the Barber's and through the season when the risk is greatest. So if we're talking about Barber's poll, we're talking about pretty much mid-spring through till sometime well into autumn when the risk of Barber's poll is there. So that's when you need to concentrate your monitoring. I guess the thing is that if the blanket advice was to simply monitor every 4 weeks, no one's going to do that for every mob. So we need to prioritise where you're going to get the best bang for your buck, and indeed, where there's not much to be gained from doing that. So it'll get back to region by region, district by district, when the worm risk is for particular types of worms. If you're talking Barber's poll, then more monitoring is always needed. And in fact, when we look at the worm egg results around Australia, there's far more in the northern tablelands of New South Wales than anywhere else in Australia, and for a very good reason. This is the biggest Barber's poll risk part of Australia. So producers have picked it up and realised that you do need to do more monitoring there because of the bigger risk of a worm that, if it's left unchecked, is going to cause terrible problems. And again, if you're in winter rainfall areas, monitoring through the dry summer periods is less rewarding than the times from sometime in autumn through to spring and early summer when worms are more likely to be there. So I guess the whole thing about the interval really needs to be matched to the risk and the type of worm and to the season. Regarding the numbers of samples you should take, the recommendation has always been 10 per flock, and all I can say is that's the very minimum. When that figure was sort of first arrived at, and it was probably sometime back in the 1980s, I wish we'd made it around 20 eggs per gram. It was always a fine line between I guess a practical activity that people are going to actually do. I mean, if you sort of say that, you have to take 50 per flock, a lot of folks just simply would not do that because of the effort involved. And in the end, you've got to convince people that it's necessary. Over the last number of years, there's been no doubt, there's been plenty of looking at the figures that show us you get a much more accurate result as you go to 20 counts rather than 10. So my recommendation always would be that you take 20, and the 10 is a very minimum. If you're only going to take sort of say 6 or 7, might as well throw them out, because the thing is, we've talked before about, in fact, that example given by that particular property showed us everything, where there's a small number of animals had high counts, most of them had low. Let's say by sheer bad luck, you got mostly those higher ones, you get a false positive or high result. Let's say you got none of the high ones, then you'd be in the other situation, where you think there wasn't a risk. So there's my answer. 20 ideally, 10 is the minimum.
Thanks, Brown. We've got a couple of questions left. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us, though we've gone very over time, but we just love your questions. That's fantastic. Are short, even pastures at a higher risk to pick up larvae, Brown, compared to variable height pastures?
In general terms, I'd expect yes. Impossible to quantify, and really the more important thing would be how many worm eggs went onto that pasture. So it could be the short even pasture. If the sheep had a very low count, 100 extra gram or something, it'd be very minimal risk. If the long uneven pasture, 500 and 600 eggs per gram, far higher risk. So I think it's the worming count is by far the more important factor. But in general terms, we'd expect a short pasture, more open to the elements, more killing power, if you like, of heat and dry and so forth, to kill worms. So there's something of a benefit there. But I'd look at the sheep more than the pasture.
Thanks, Brown. If you have triple active resistance, white clear and moxie, will double dose rates be an option as used to be when single actives were used 30 years ago?
I guess what first point to make is that as soon as you move to a different dose rate than recommended, you're outside the territory where the company providing the product would support you if something went wrong and there was some ill effect on sheep. I guess one point to make is that with double dose rates, there's been some evidence in the past of an increased kill of resistant worms with increasing doses, but it's a very uneven thing. Most times, of course, we're drenching to the heaviest weight in the flock. So let's say your sheep, let's say your heaviest animal was say, I don't know, let's say 60 kilos, and your lightest animal in the flock was 30 kilos. Then already that some of those lower ones are getting close to a double dose anyway. And that's safe. I mean, the companies know that. There's all that the testing has to encompass that to make sure that the product is safe, even though animals are getting effectively a double, and sometimes with an extra squirt, maybe more than that. I'd be pretty cautious about doubling doses, and I wouldn't recommend it as a routine strategy. For where resistance occurred. If you're going to go down that path, then I'd very much talk to an advisor about it and set up some sort of, I guess, a mini check against a particular worm population that there's any increase in benefit in increasing the dose. Sometimes there isn't, and it varies between the antibiotics. And the risk you have with the triples always is that levamisole has a lower safety margin than the others. And if it meant by some animals are already getting, let's say, a double dose because they're the lightest in the flock, then you double again, they're getting a 4 times dose. So you may well be getting into danger territory. So I'd be very cautious indeed about using increased doses as a strategy.
Thanks, Brown. We're down to the last couple of questions. According to WormBoss for non-seasonal New South Wales, the pre-lambing threshold for drenching is 150 EPG. Would you drench if you were just under 140?
Bear in mind, there's a lot of grey areas around whenever we do a worm egg count. Let's say we come back and and our figure is 145 eggs per gram. The reality is that if we retested those very same samples, it could be 200 or it could be 100, and so forth. And then certainly if we went back to the flock and took another 10 or my ideal 20 counts, then again you could get that sort of variation. So there's a fair bit of a margin of error around every figure we get. So I suppose the only way I'd answer that is to say that if you're pretty close to it, I wouldn't use the 150 cut off, and sometimes for other situations it can be a different figure. I wouldn't use that as a total sort of an absolute. And the worm egg count simply isn't capable of being that specific. If you're at 145 eggs per gram, 140 eggs per gram, I'd call that it's equivalent to 150, and I'd go that course. If it had been 90, I'd say no, don't need to. But if you're that close, within a certain I don't know 10 or 20% of a cutoff figure, then I'd assume that there's a fair chance that you could be over that.
Thanks, Brown. And our last question's been asked multiple times, so I thought I'd save it till last. What's your thoughts on bulk worm egg counts versus individuals? Do you think you get a better result having a bigger subset and an average rather than individual?
Look, in general terms, I prefer the. I think a bulk count gives you, well, there's been plenty of evidence, gives you the same end result as the average of the individual counts. So the only issue is how much benefit there is in the individual information of the individual counts. So and I don't think there's any problem about that as plenty of information on that. But for bulk counts being based generally on more counts. If you can do 20 and do it as a bulk, I prefer that than doing 10 individuals pretty much every time. I think that's the case. If the only time that I'd go against that, and generally would be in consultation with the people who are doing the egg count, or maybe a vet or a person you're speaking to, if there is some equivocation over whether there's likely to be a problem or not, and the individual counts might matter, then for sure go back to individuals. But every time going for more counts, 20 rather than 10, has got to be better, and a bulk is fine for that. Occasionally with Barber's pole, you'll find there's an absolute spike, and one or two animals have got some weird over-the-top count, 6,000 eggs per gram, and the others are all sitting around about 200 or 300 eggs per gram. Rarely you see that, and if you resample those animals in a week's time, it would sort it out. Chances are that all would be higher. But even so, even in those situations, that one single animal is not going to sway the whole lot. So in a roundabout way, I'd say go bigger numbers of samples, however you do it, rather than a matter of 10 individuals.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Brown. That was a massive webinar and a huge question time. Thank you, everybody, for your commitment to question time. That was great. Brown, you did really well to get through all those questions. Thanks so much.
Yeah, all good. No, thanks very much. Yep, and very happy to be contacted anytime. So thank you.
Thanks, Brown.